What about education reform? So that had begun a little bit before you became Education Secretary. The Nation at Risk report was in the first term of President Reagan. But you obviously elevated it and focused the discussion on 2 or 3 key issues. And I mean, how do you feel, what is it, almost 25, 30 years later, I guess, on the case, especially on the K through 12, on the elementary and secondary education. We can talk about higher education too, that's its own set of issues, but I guess our main focus was the elementary and secondary education.
Yeah, the debate goes on, and that's probably where, we had, the most disagreeable conversations. The teachers' unions and so on. And I remember, I think when I die, they'll write something in the Chicago paper about my visits to Chicago.
Right.
I remember going to Chicago and saying, these are the worst schools in the country. And the spokesman from the mayor's office said, why? And I said, you have a 50% dropout rate. And of the kids who remain in school, 50% of them score in the bottom, 20% of the country. And the guy did a couple of calculations. He said, we're not the worst. Detroit's the worst. I said, well, do not be guilty of low aspirations, And so we told the truth. Actually, the first thing that was said when I said these are the worst schools in the country, I'll never forget it. The guy said, what do you mean by that? And I said, that's a perfectly clear sentence.
Yeah, right.
The worst is the worst. And they weren't used to that kind of talk, but I said a lot of this about our system. I mean, you test our kids in math science, which is a special interest of mine, in the elementary grades particularly, and our kids do pretty well, top third, top quarter. By the time they're in middle school, they're in the middle. By the time they're in high school, they're toward the bottom.
So international comparison.
So the longer they stay in school, the dumber they get relative to kids in other countries. That's crazy. But the elementary school proves the point. It's not genetic. It's not in the DNA. Otherwise, our third graders wouldn't be doing pretty well. It's a system that doesn't have the expectations, doesn't have the accountability. We spend a ton of money. Higher education's another category, kind of in its own world, totally in its own world. But we just have to be doing a lot better because we're getting our brains beat out internationally by kids from the Asian Rim countries and elsewhere.
And what would be the key? There's so many things that could be fixed, and what's been most encouraging to you over the years you've been fighting these fights? What's the toughest obstacle? What's the best leverage point, do you think, for improving education? I mean,
the toughest part is the organized resistance, and that's still primarily the teachers' unions. Not the members of the teachers' unions. There's a lot of good teachers. The teaching force is in 70% adequate, 80% adequate, I would say. But the failure to police the 20% that isn't is almost criminal.
I remember you saying this when you were education secretary. I think it's nice to reward the best teachers. Obviously, they should be, if possible, rewarded more. The unions make that harder. But getting rid of the worst is really maybe even more important, actually.
The research bill shows that very clearly. The 5 or 8 or 10% of the teachers who aren't up to it really do a lot of harm. I mean, what else do you need to know? The research done by Milken Institute, backed up by other places. Take a kid in a 50th percentile in the 4th grade in math. Give that kid an excellent teacher for 2 years. That child will be in the 80th percentile. Give that kid a teacher ranked as poor by his peers and the principal for 2 years, and that kid will move from the 50th to the 20th percentile. What more do you need to know but to encourage the good teachers and to get the poor teachers out of the classroom? There are some other problems, with the system. I mean, we don't reward success. You remember when we visited schools, and you were with me on some of these trips, people would tell us we fudge our data in terms of our failure rate and our kids who need special education because we get more money from the federal government the worse we are. Yeah. It's a perverse system. But good news, you said, we made a point of going to places where they were doing a good job. The Jaime Escalanes of the world, the great teachers, the schools that were succeeding against the odds. And there are such places in Chicago and everywhere else.
And school choice, vouchers, charter schools, you feel that's still...
It's still a big thing. It's not the solution, but it's part of it. It's competition, which is a good thing. The content, which was one of the things we talked about, remains, I think, paramount. And there is... it gets a little complicated, a little inside baseball, but there are two kind of competing theories of learning and education in the early grades. One of them is the purpose of schools is to teach children how to learn. The other one is the purpose of schools is to teach something, is for children to learn something. And I'm in the second camp. The first camp is the formalists, but you have to start by learning something. And that means can be math, can be biology, can be literature, but content reigns. Content is what really develops the mind, the brain, and gets kids to be able to take an interest in another subject. I've been doing a lot of research on math education lately. Ability in math predicts interest in math. That's fair enough. If you're able to do it, you tend to be more interested in doing it. But it's reciprocal. It also turns out that interest in math predicts ability. So if you can encourage, by good teaching, an interest in math and science, you can get more kids going in this direction. And the way you do that is by teaching the content.